Alright, welcome back everybody. This lesson is geared towards an introduction to photography, and in this presentation we're going to cover the basics of camera settings, and in the last presentation we went over lighting techniques, and we ended that lesson off by talking about shutter speed and exposure. So let's go ahead and start from where we left off and talk more about exposure compensation and ISO. We're going to dive deeper into camera modes in part 2 of this lesson, but for now let's go ahead and start here. To adjust the exposure compensation and manipulate the ISO, you'll typically have to enter your camera settings, and you can do this by using the LCD screen or by the dedicated programmable dials that your camera body has, but most cell phones will have exposure and ISO options as well, and so I think that's another good reason to go ahead and start here. So, why focus on camera settings? The main goal is to get the picture to look correct in every aspect, and these aspects include focus, which is how sharp your subject is, brightness, which is the exposure and the light in your scene, the background blur, which is basically your depth of field, motion blur, which is captured motion and it's either going to be frozen or blurry, and of course composition, which is the artistic components of your photograph. Photographers should always attempt to improve their photos by either adding or reducing any one of these aspects. There are of course other aspects to consider, but these are the main ones that you will adjust the most when taking photographs. You can always spend more time in auto mode on your camera, and we will talk more about auto mode functions too, but eventually you will want to start taking more control over your artwork. This is when understanding camera settings will start to come in handy, plus being able to manipulate the camera settings will further enhance your own creativity. So we are going to cover the basics of camera settings and camera modes, but today we are going to cover how to adjust the brightness using the exposure triangle, how to adjust brightness using exposure compensation, and how to adjust the ISO in your camera settings. So what is exposure? Exposure is how long a photo has been exposed to light. Now this term indicates the amount of brightness that a photo may or may not contain. Overexposed photos are typically too bright, and underexposed photos are usually too dark. Sometimes artists choose to do this on purpose for creative purposes, but for the most part, you want to try and get your exposure correct. So how can you adjust exposure though? So here is one way that you can adjust your exposure. This meter can be found in your camera's settings, and when you adjust it, it commands your camera to either add or reduce the exposure in the scene of your photograph. Now the goal is to try and keep the meter at 0, and you can always adjust the meter by adding or reducing some stops to compensate that exposure. However, whether your camera allows you to or not, you should try to avoid compensating more than 3 stops of exposure at a time. This is because you can adjust other functions from the exposure triangle instead, and you will produce a much higher quality result. Nonetheless, this function overrides the camera's sensitivity to exposure and ISO. Some cameras have a dedicated or programmable dial for their exposure compensation, whereas other cameras require the user to enter the settings to make adjustments, and you can refer to your own camera's manual to learn how to find this function, but even your cell phone should have this feature too, so if you want to, check on that as well. This method should be used sparingly and or exclusively to specific shooting conditions because you will get much better results by adjusting other functions on your camera. However, this feature works great for these types of shooting conditions. When the background is much brighter than the subject or vice versa, snow days when the highlights are overexposed due to all the snow on the ground, and cloudy days when the light source is either reduced or darkened. Light determines the exposure, and so you can adjust the actual light source to further control the exposure in your scene, and this is what all the pros do. They take control of their environment and their lighting, and then they choose which settings work best for their project. We will learn a little bit more about gaffing and lighting techniques in future content, but for now, let's stick with basic camera settings. In conjunction with a light source, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture will also control how much light enters the camera's sensor. This is when we introduce the exposure triangle. And here's a little mini word root lesson. The word tri means 3, right? A triangle has 3 sides to it, just like a tricycle has 3 wheels. And so there are 3 main characteristics of the exposure triangle. You have ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Understanding this diagram is a good way to help you get out of auto mode. And auto mode is a great place to hang out if you're a beginner, but eventually you will want to take more control over your projects. Aperture and shutter speed are camera modes that we will talk about more in part 2 of this lesson. We're going to go ahead and cover ISO in this presentation. Let's go ahead and briefly introduce aperture and shutter speed though. Okay, so Your aperture is the hole or pupil. Because your pupil acts as an aperture for your eye, it allows light to enter the camera. Much like light entering through your eyes, the aperture will be located on your camera lens, and it is also referred to as the f-stop. Most cell phones and action cameras have fixed apertures, which limits your ability to change your f-stop number. Shutter speed. This is the time that it takes for your shutter to open and close. This is much like a shuttered door to a garage. It opens and closes, acting as another barrier which allows light to enter when it is open. And lastly, your ISO. This function is best suited at the lowest possible number because you want to avoid introducing noise to your photographs. Manipulating any one of these functions will affect the other, which technically makes this a balancing game of camera settings. Again, we will define each of these functions in more depth as we progress forward, but for now, let's go ahead and talk about each of them in terms of the exposure triangle. When you adjust the exposure triangle, you are essentially adjusting the brightness. However, each side that you adjust, you will off-balance another side. That means by adjusting any one side of the exposure triangle, you are going to also affect at least one other side. What this does is it causes the user to make adjustments like a game of balance. But over time, you'll get so good at balancing everything, you won't even realize that you're doing it. To help you understand this diagram more, each arrow indicates a process of going from dim to bright, or less to more, or both. For instance, when you increase the ISO on your camera, you will also increase your camera's sensitivity to light, and this is shown on the diagram. So looking at the ISO function at the bottom of the triangle, you see that increasing the ISO will also increase the amount of noise introduced to your photo. So what is noise? Well, image noise occurs when you increase the ISO. Digital noise is essentially just film grain. So what is grain? Well, grain is sort of like pointillism art, and some artists actually choose to add grain into their photos or videos for a creative look. Sometimes grain does look good, but for the most part, sharp and crisp photos are what are desired. So if you want to try to avoid introducing grain into your photos, be sure to stay consciously aware of what happens when you start to adjust your camera's ISO. Alright, so let's come back to the exposure triangle. Let's take a look at aperture now. When you increase the aperture of your camera lens, you are also increasing the quantity of light that can reach your camera's sensor, and this can actually be measured. However, by looking at the diagram, you can see that when you increase your aperture, you are also reducing the amount of depth perception your photo may contain. So if you want to add depth of field to your photos, you will need to reduce your aperture as much as possible. Moving over to shutter speed, if you increase the shutter speed, you are telling the camera to make the shutter close faster. What this also does is it makes the other characteristics shown on the diagram decrease, or vice versa depending on how you adjust it. But if you happen to want a lot of motion blur in your photos, then you will need to slow down your shutter speed. If you happen to be in a low light situation, let's say something like astrophotography, then you will also want to slow down your shutter speed. This diagram is a great way for beginners to start understanding how exposure works, and once you start to grasp these concepts and what they do, you will subconsciously make these adjustments without even having to think of the exposure triangle. For now though, if you want to go ahead and get out of auto mode, take a screenshot of this image and refer to it in the field if you need to. So what is ISO? The origin of ISO comes from the International Organization for Standardization, which essentially just makes this measurement equally agreed upon by everyone internationally. But ISO is a measurement that refers to film sensitivity. ISO is not an acronym. It's actually just the word we use to calculate a measurement. Once you do access your camera settings, you can adjust your ISO manually, or you can even just set it to auto. Your camera does a pretty good job of making automatic adjustments, and if you're using a cell phone to take photos, then your phone is probably already on auto mode. Alright, so more on ISO. When are you supposed to make adjustments to your camera's ISO? Well, cloudy days, dark nights, shooting at midday, these are all different conditions for adjusting your ISO. The light source is different in each one of these photos, and each scenario constitutes a good reason why you would want to adjust your ISO. However, you want to be cautious, because increasing the ISO will also increase noise as well. You might not be able to tell, but the nighttime photo in the middle there, it does have a lot of grain to it, because the ISO is probably very high to compensate those low light conditions. Well, that concludes this presentation, and what we covered today was how to make adjustments to exposure in order to obtain the correct amount of brightness in your photos and videos. We learned how you can adjust exposure by using the exposure triangle diagram, and also by accessing the exposure compensation and the ISO functions in your camera settings. We learned that manipulating any one of these functions will adversely affect the other, and it is up to you as the creative to find the perfect balance of exposure for your artwork. If you're feeling generous today, do consider hitting the like and subscribe button. Tap on the notification bell to be notified when I upload new videos, and you can share to anybody who's willing to learn, colleagues, students, friends, and family. Hope y'all have a great week, and I'll see y'all in the next one.